Well, good morning, everyone. We are just opening the doors and allowing people into this virtual webinar this morning. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for joining us as part of the Bristol Housing Festival. I'm going to be handing over to our chair, Nick James, very shortly. But for now, I just wanted to let you know that this is one of a number of events that the Bristol Housing Festival, are hosting as part of a 3-week series of events as our Virtual Expo 2020. So we're in our final week of the Expo, so if you have missed any of the events, any of the one-to-one interviews, any of the community stories, or the information about the social housing timeline, for example, you can find all of it on our website, bristolhousingfestival.org.uk. You can also watch all the webinars back and those one-to-one videos on our YouTube channel, which is just, if you search for the Bristol Housing Festival, you'll find it there. So all the webinars have been recorded, so anything you've missed, you can pick back up there. So just wanted to say thank you so much for joining us this morning. We have people coming in the virtual door as I'm speaking. We are looking forward this afternoon as well. After this event, we are working with the Norwest Media Centre and Automated Architecture to run an event this afternoon called Making Together, all about tools and tech and tips for levelling up communities. And then our final event of the whole 3 weeks of the Bristol Housing Festival Expo is tomorrow afternoon in partnership with the CIH, the Chartered Institute of Housing, and we're going to be looking at Homes for Heroes. So do join us for our last couple of events, but for now, thank you so much for attending this event, and I am going to officially hand over to Nick James to lead us through. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you, Jessie. Welcome to this morning's webinar, everyone. So we're going to be talking with a number of speakers today about creating carbon neutral communities. As Jess mentioned, this is part of the Bristol Housing Festival, and also we are streaming this on YouTube, so it will be there for posterity for you to go back to later if there's any key nuggets of information you want to hear a second time. I'd like to start first by thanking our sponsor, NetZero Buildings, for sponsoring today's event, and Steve from NetZero Buildings will be one of our speakers later today. So just a few words from me really to kind of set the scene before we go into each of the speakers presenting sort of 5 minutes or so on their particular take on the topic. So the purpose of this event is to explore what's possible really in terms of creating carbon neutral communities, and also looking at the different elements that need to come together to make that happen. So just personally, my interest in this spans back 20 years or so of working in sustainable housing, and carbon neutrality as part of that has always been a key issue for the industry, but also one where I think, sort of reflecting back on those 20 years, there remains still too few leaders really and examples of getting close really to what is good enough. So I think we're now at a very exciting point. Obviously the clock continues to tick in terms of us needing to make meaningful action towards tackling our climate emergency, and also the roles our homes and communities play in this. And obviously housing has a whole load of other pressures on it at the moment as well, in terms of affordability, quality, availability, etc. So there's a nexus here between kind of good quality housing and carbon neutrality that we need to kind of get right. So we'll be looking at the wider issue through a number of different perspectives today. And obviously the carbon impacts of our homes is not just about the energy used to maintain them, to heat them and power them, but it's also about understanding the carbon associated with the energy used to make the materials that goes into our home, and the kind of end of life issues when our homes are taken apart. And then, as importantly, from a lifestyles perspective, it's about how we travel within our communities, where our food comes from, what we buy, what we throw away, etc. All part of that bigger sort of carbon perspective. So that's kind of enough from me. We've got some great speakers lined up today to look at this. They're each going to speak for a few minutes to introduce themselves and give their thoughts on the topic, and then we're going to go into conversation. You will see at the bottom of your screen, hopefully, there's a Q&A function. So as and when questions occur to you as the speakers are speaking, please do pop your questions in there, and we'll try and get around to as many of them as we can partway through this session, and we will aim to wrap up at 11:30. So that's enough from me. What I'd like to do first is to ask Steve Murphy from Zero Carbon Buildings to have his 5 minutes, and I will be tough on your 5 minutes, Steve. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Good morning, everyone. My name's Steve Murphy. I'm the Chief Exec here at NetZero Buildings. We produce a range of low energy and energy positive buildings for the residential, education and healthcare sectors. And we are passionate about doing our bit to help to create zero carbon communities. Did you realise that more than 45% of the carbon footprint of the UK comes from the built environment, both the carbon tied up in the structures and the energy needed to run those buildings, to heat them, light them and ventilate them in operation. So if the UK is serious about being carbon neutral by 2050, we have to change what we build and how we build. And we are determined at NZB to do our bit to pragmatically disrupt the traditional construction sector by doing things a bit differently. But even if you are not motivated by the climate science, isn't it just a great thing to do to enable people to live and to work in modern, bright, light buildings that are well insulated and that have low or zero energy costs? And we've delivered in the last 5 years over 100 schemes which do just that. We routinely build schools that generate 2 to 3 times the electricity that they use in operation. Those ratios are much more difficult to achieve in housing because of the differing relationship between roof space and occupied space. But our standard house, which I'm sitting in one now, this is one of our show homes, delivers zero or energy positivity in operation. So it can be done, and you know the way in which it's done is also important to us. We're very particular about how we go about delivering these fantastic structures. So the bulk of our structure is constructed off-site in a factory environment, and we do that for a number of reasons. Firstly, it gives me a much better chance to look after the health, safety and well-being of our workforce, and that's important to me. There's little point in doing any of this if people don't go home safe and healthy at the end of each working day. So that alone would be justification for doing things the way that we do. However, the same platform gives us a fantastic opportunity to better control the quality of what we do. One of the biggest travesties with the traditional construction environment is the gap between what gets designed and what gets built. There's no point in designing a great building if you don't build it in a good way. And we routinely deliver structures that meet or exceed their design criteria. And then finally, the factory environment provides the best way for us to control our waste, both by reducing it at source and recycling and reusing where possible. And then when we do have waste streams that need to be disposed of, we can do that in the most sustainable and ethical way possible. So there's a combination of things that all add together, that it's not just about what we do, it's about how we do it in order to deliver our goal. So as you can see, we're not just talking about carbon neutral communities, we're doing our bit to try to deliver them. So thank you, Nick.
Great, thanks, Steve. 4 and a bit minutes, perfect. Thank you very much. So interesting, as a number of questions come in related to that, which we'll pick up later. So can I next hand over to Mark Letcher from Bristol City Council? Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Nick. Morning, everybody. My name, as you say, is Mark Letcher. I'm a project manager in the sustainability team at the City Council. I'm sure everybody's aware there's quite a number of things going on around both the built environment and more broadly in terms of the move towards carbon neutrality and zero carbon. So I thought I'd just take a couple of minutes to set out some of the kind of key pieces of what is quite a complex jigsaw. So in 2018, in November 2018, the Council declared a climate emergency. I think it was the first authority to do that. And even though we had existing commitments to put the city to be on course to be run entirely on clean energy by 2050, that pledge to make the city carbon neutral by 2030 has really put the rocket boosters under various strands of work which are going on to do that. So that pledge led on to a climate emergency action plan. And from that, there were two initial pieces of work. The first was to look at all of the existing activities and policy proposals and to work out how far that was going to get the city towards being carbon neutral. And then the second piece was to work out what additional activities were going to be needed to do that by 2030. And because this whole agenda is clearly much broader than the remit of the City Council, that led on to the formation of the One City Climate Strategy, which has brought together a whole range of stakeholders from across the different sectors within the city to think about how that can be delivered and to help kind of drive that process of delivering that strategy and those actions going forward. And that One City Climate Strategy is supported by an Environmental Sustainability Board, as well as an advisory committee, which is a bit like the Committee on Climate Change that advises the government. And broadly speaking, the actions under that plan fall under 10 headings, which cover all the sectors you would expect. So that's transport and buildings, the decarbonisation of heat and electricity and how we produce a kind of flexible, smart electricity system, consumption and waste, business and the economy, the public, voluntary, community and social enterprise services, which is obviously going to be absolutely key to delivering this, as well as the natural environment, food. And then there's a final one which brings together the interdependencies between the different infrastructure elements that form part of that plan. So that's the kind of overview of the sort of driving strategies that are pushing this forward. I wanted to say just a couple of things around the built environment. In terms of policy, if you want to build a new scheme, new development in Bristol at the moment, you're required to reduce the residual emissions of that scheme by about 20%, at least 20%. And what we're proposing under the new policy, which has been out to consultation last year, was that should change to 100% reduction in emissions, i.e. zero carbon in new development. But coupled to that, there's a much stronger focus on both climate adaptation and resilience. We need new buildings to be resilient to the quite marked changes which are expected in local climate between now and say 2080. And so there's quite a shift there, as well as including things like the embodied carbon of buildings, which has just been talked about in the previous discussion. Now that new policy was due to have come in to effect about 2020, but it was delayed by the Joint Spatial Plan. And so I think it's more likely now that that new policy will come into effect sometime late 2023, early 2024. And so one of the things we're looking at as an authority is whether we need to adopt a new standard now where we're the developer in the city prior to that new policy coming into effect. So that's an ongoing discussion at the moment. The other thing we're looking at, or another commitment that falls really under that initial pledge made by the council, is for direct emissions from energy and transport related to the city council activities to be carbon neutral by 2025. So that's ahead of the overall 2030 target. And just to conclude, I was going to say a couple of things about some of the practical implications. It won't come as a surprise to anyone that heat is by far the biggest thing, the most challenging area of the energy system when it comes to decarbonisation. And so the heat network which exists in the city at the moment is in the process of being expanded, both to serve new development, but also thinking about how we can meet the energy needs of existing buildings within the city. And then a parallel piece of work which is going on at the same time is about decarbonising the heat which is delivered via that heat network. So that means shifting away from gas to things like heat from the floating harbour, from heat sources below the ground, from former mine workings, from sewage, and then potentially further down the line, utilising waste heat from Avonmouth and Sevenside. So that work is ongoing in parallel to the expansion of the heat network. And then we're also looking at how we're going to decarbonise heat in existing buildings across the city, which is by far the biggest challenge, as I've already said. And broadly speaking, that falls into two camps, as it were. The first is about refurbishing buildings to the point where they can economically use heat pumps, some form of renewable heating, to replace gas. About 80% plus of buildings in the city use gas for heating. So we need to get off gas and we need to refurbish them to a standard where we can do that. And where we can't, we think the most viable route is going to be by connecting them to the heat network. So still doing refurbishment work, but then bringing in a low carbon source of heat, very low carbon source of heat from the heat network. So broadly speaking, that's the two strands on that. So I'm going to wrap it up there. I'm very happy to take questions, but I'll leave it there and hand over to the next speaker.
Great, thank you, Mark. Really helpful, kind of, I guess, city context, policy, and practical. And I think touching there on existing buildings, which I think is a key one. And I'm pretty sure our next speakers want to pick up on some of that. Just to say, a few of you have been raising questions. If questions occur to you as and when, please use the Q&A box to put them in now, and I will do my best to try and cluster them into some kind of sensible order for discussion later. So if I can hand over to Lucy Pedler now, thank you.
Thanks very much, Nick. Good morning, everybody. My name is Lucy Pedler. I'm an architect and the founder and director of the Green Register, which is a not-for-profit organisation based in Bristol. Started up in London 20 years ago. We've just celebrated our 20th anniversary. And what I've been very lucky to be able to do is to blend my two passions in life, which is architecture and protecting the environment. So I'm going to talk to you today about some of the work that we do at the Green Register to try and address some of the issues that some of our speakers have already talked about. Today is about creating carbon neutral communities, and as I think Steve mentioned, or one of the previous speakers mentioned, that there's various aspects to our carbon footprint. Each one of us produces about 6.5 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions per year, and very, very bluntly speaking, that's broken down between buildings, travel and food, although I suspect that balance is quite different at the moment with COVID, but pre-COVID that was the sort of split. So in my personal life and all of our personal lives, we can affect our carbon footprint by travelling sustainably, biking, and I hope can hear from John about that, eating locally seasonal food. But what I do as an architect and director of the Green Register is we try to spread the word about how buildings affect the environment. So Steve's already mentioned that in the UK about 45% of emissions come from buildings, and I may be able to answer one of the questions that was asked in the Q&A. That includes construction, operation and maintenance of a building, but interestingly that doesn't cover demolition or reuse. So it's quite a limited measure. If you look at both the embodied carbon of the building materials and also post use of the building, it's bigger than that. So that's just construction, maintenance and operation. And over the last 20 years, we at the Green Register have providing training on all aspects of sustainable buildings. So it's on embodied energy, it's on operational energy, it's on health and well-being and so on. It's all the aspects. And Mark's already sort of talked about what Bristol is doing and looking at it holistically. That is our key message, which is this has to be looked at holistically. Most of our delegates are architects, engineers, surveyors, building control, planners, if we're lucky. The most difficult audience we've found to attract to our training are contractors. And we've been really lucky because we've been funded by BEIS, the Business Enterprise Industrial Strategy, to run a training program called Futureproof. And we've been doing this for the last 18 months, and we're providing free training to contractors. because Steve mentioned earlier what's referred to as the performance gap. That's the difference between what you design a building, what actually happens. And there's multiple reasons why that happens, but part of it is because contractors don't build to the design. I'm not saying it's the contractor's fault, it's the architect's fault, it's everybody's fault. Everybody's got a part to play. But if, as an architect, I can design a passive house building, but actually that's probably not a very good example because that's monitored throughout, but a very low energy building. But if the contractor doesn't understand, for example, the concept of airtightness, we're not going to get the buildings that we've designed. So we have got 70 so far contractors going through our Futureproof training program. And they're a delightful bunch of builders. They're all keen to learn. They want to do the right thing, as most of us do. They don't want to be lumped with other builders who are, maybe road traders or cowboy builders. They want to do a good job. And we are delighted with the interaction we've had with builders. Because of COVID, we're now delivering these online. And what we're amazed at is that builders like the online training. And so now we're offering it nationwide. But I'd like to conclude really by saying what we need to do is to spread the word. At the moment, the Futureproof is just on the west of England. That's what we're allowed to fund builders to attend free. And in fact, we're working with some of Mark's colleagues on perhaps providing some localised training to Bristol to get a bigger group of contractors who can build good quality building. I have to say, Futureproof is about retrofit, so it's not new build. Although there's a big overlap, if you're retrofitting your house, you're often building a new extension or you're doing a loft conversion or something, so it's not quite as black and white as that. So my call to action really for everybody here is to let anybody that you know who's a contractor in the west of England about Futureproof. This training is going to be free up until March and maybe on beyond. We're applying for some more funding. But we feel this is a huge gap that we can fill to provide householders who want good quality building with contractors who know how to deliver that. Thanks, Nick.
Great, thank you, Lucy. I think we're tackling this from various different angles. It's really interesting. So I think touching on the importance of the chain from sort of design through construction and into reality, and the skills and awareness and kind of professionalism, I think, that needs to run through that to get carbon neutral buildings out the other side is so key. I'm pretty sure we're going to come back to some of that in Q&A, so thanks for that. So our final speaker this morning is John Usher from Sustrans, who a few speakers have touched on kind of the importance of transport as part of our overall carbon footprint as individuals. So I'm sure John will have a few thoughts on that. So over to you, John. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. Good morning, everyone. My name's John Usher. I'm Head of Partnerships for the South of England at Sustrans. Sustrans is a sustainable transport charity. We're based in Bristol, founded over 40 years ago. And we make it easier for people to walk and cycle, simple strapline. And some might say that we've not really made much ground over the last 40 years. We tend to struggle against the tide of motor traffic and ever increasing motor traffic. And we've had a glimpse of a potential future, or alternative future, I guess, as a result of COVID. We have a huge challenge in Bristol to get to net zero by 2030. I don't think we can really understate that. Transport currently contributes about 1/3 of all our carbon emissions in the city. And we've already heard from Mark, the One City Climate Strategy suggests we need to make some fairly drastic changes to the way we move around the city. So the climate strategy suggests a 40% reduction in vehicle mileage to reach that target. And to give a sense of the scale of that change, that means that no more than 20% of journeys in the city can be made by car by 2030. And that's against the current scenario of just over 50% of all journeys are currently made by car in the city. We are a successful cycling city. We were named Cycling City in 2008. And we have a higher rate of walking and cycling than most other core cities in the UK. But we've still got a huge way to go. And transitioning to that change is really, I think, where carbon neutral communities comes in. We've talked about the quality of the buildings. Now, I think what I'm interested in is the space between them, but also where we build those communities that can have a massive influence over how we get around and how we live our lives. Now, we need to make those communities, those places where we live, those neighbourhoods, areas where walking and cycling can become the obvious choice, because we've purposely planned our city in such a way to ensure that all the things we need are no more than a 10 or 15-minute walk away from our front door, which is why we've called on the government to commit to a 20-minute neighbourhood planning principle. And simply that means that it gives people the ability to live far more sustainably, where people can live close to where they work, or albeit where we live is currently where we work for a lot of people during COVID lockdowns, but where they shop, where they spend time, where they socialise, can all be within that that kind of 15-minute neighbourhood radius, as well as all the services we need. Thinking about where we locate things like doctors' surgeries as well can be massively important to enable sustainable travel. We've heard a lot probably over the last 6 months of the 15-minute city, particularly from places like Paris. Anne Hidalgo in Paris has kind of put in place that idea of creating a city of villages. And I think we really ought to be aiming for something similar in Bristol to enable us to get to that net zero target. And I think we can get there by implementing low traffic neighbourhoods. Places or neighbourhoods where walking and cycling are the natural choice to get around, because we've largely removed the danger of car traffic. We've all, albeit under fairly harrowing circumstances with COVID, we've all had that opportunity to live in low traffic environments during the first lockdown, where our streets were quiet, but unfortunately things have returned to the old normal far too quickly. But where they have been implemented, these low traffic neighbourhoods, they can have huge benefits to society in terms of health, quality of life, and also to community resilience as well. So probably the best example in the UK is Waltham Forest. It was named a Mini Holland in 2016, but they've decreased traffic levels by 40% in the neighbourhoods that were affected. They've reduced car ownership, the need to own a car, the expense of having to own a car, by 20%. They've increased levels of walking and cycling, as you'd expect, but they haven't increased the levels of car traffic on the roads around the outside of low traffic neighbourhoods. Amazingly, they've managed to increase life expectancy by 7 months in some of the neighbourhoods that they've removed car traffic from. And they've also increased the amount of dwell time in the street. And that sense of community resilience, which I think we all need right now, can be achieved by removing through traffic from neighbourhoods. We've known since the 1960s that you're less likely to know your neighbours the more traffic there is on your street, for example. So that sense of being able to talk and hold a conversation with neighbours, enabling your children to play outside, can all contribute to a sense of community resilience. And I think transport's the one area where we've got the real opportunity. The council has the agency to change the way we travel by changing the highway network. So we've got a real opportunity to go further and faster with transport than we have necessarily with the built environment, which can maybe require, as we've heard from Mark, in terms of the regulation or the policies that need to be in place to force developers to make those changes. But we have the opportunity to do that with our own highway network. It's within the agency of the local authority to change. But it's incumbent on all of us to change the way we travel, the way we move around, and not to rely on the car for quite so many journeys as we currently do. And I look forward to the questions actually that come up as we start to discuss this and how we create carbon neutral communities.
Great, thanks, John. Really interesting. I mean, I think we've collectively covered a lot of the diversity of the issue. Sorry, sudden heavy rainfall. I don't know if people can hear that pinging on my roof. Can't do much about that, I'm afraid. So I just wanted to kind of start the questions with looking at one area which I think you all touched on, but was around sort of health and well-being, linked to a lot of this, whether it's around sort of the health aspects of our homes, or whether it's the exercise linked to maybe walking and cycling more, and the connectedness and maybe mental health benefits of being more maybe involved in your local area, or more kind of connected into your neighborhood. I just wonder whether we're sort of missing a trick collectively in terms of how we are positioning the benefits of carbon neutral communities, really, because there are a lot of other aspects that are really beneficial. And I think carbon is, it's not, as a story, it may not land that well or be recognized by a lot of people, but actually health and well-being, I think possibly is a different angle. I wonder if anyone's got any thoughts on that. I think you all kind of touched on it, but you feel that sort of a health-led approach might actually be part of us unlocking this at the rate and scale we need to. Anyone? John?
Well, I think, if we take the Bristol context where, health inequalities play out, massively in terms of, where you live has a direct bearing on your healthy life expectancy, for example, and the most deprived wards in the city, so places like Harcliffe and Withywood, can expect to have a 10 years or sometimes greater than 10-year reduction in healthy life expectancy compared with the most affluent places like Stoke Bishop and Westbury-on-Trim. So, can't understate the impact of where you live, what you have around you, can have on your personal health and well-being, and how you can have a positive impact by changing, fairly simple changes to the physical environment. But also there's then the question of what is available on the doorstep. Lucy talked about food and food security. For some communities, the only food available is the local Asda. So it is a massively intertwined, complex problem. So it's not just transport working on its own. It's not just homes working on its own. It is community in the greatest sense of the word, I think.
Mark, is there anything, I guess, from a city scale level, in terms of, you mentioned the sort of one city climate strategy, but obviously there's a bigger one city suite of strategies. Is there kind of a link made between health and sort of carbon, I guess, in terms of climate, comfort, all those kind of issues?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's absolutely critical. And reflecting on the time I've been working in this sector, which is almost 30 years now, for as long as I can remember, we've been talking about trying to bring together the health agenda and the energy and carbon agenda. And I think there's broad agreement on both sides that that's a desirable thing to do and a kind of helpful thing to do. The reality is it's quite difficult to do that in practice. I think we're starting to see that emerge now. So it's much more common for doctors' practices to start thinking about the implications of people living in poor properties and how that might be addressed. And there are various kind of referral schemes to deal with that. So I think the two particular examples from the point of view of the built environment, one around fuel poverty and the affordability of energy, and indeed in making this extraordinary change that we have to, in shifting away from the way we've got used to heating buildings, which is primarily with gas, to different ways. We have to do that in a way which is affordable. And actually the most obvious way of doing that is when we build new buildings, we need to build them in a way so that they will permanently be very, very cheap to heat and run. And we can do that. Technically, we can do that. The reality is it's slightly harder to kind of make the system work to do that. So that's one particular one. And then I guess the other one is around climate resilience. So we had a period of hot weather this summer, and we know that there are particular communities who are particularly vulnerable to the effects of very hot weather. And so we need to be designing our built environment and think about our existing built environment so that people can maintain a high level of comfort under those very different conditions without suffering. And there are very specific examples, for example, around things like care homes, where we're looking to make sure that we have higher standards so that we deal with that problem now rather than that kind of hitting us further down the line. So I think it's absolutely essential we bring those two bits together. I don't think it's easy by any means, but I think we're starting to make some headway on that.
I don't know if so Lucy or Steve wants to come in on that, but I think particularly I'd be interested to get your thoughts on the overheating bit, actually, because obviously heating for for a long time has been the focus, and trying to make sure that we can keep our homes comfortable in terms of sort of affordable heat. But actually, as Mark said, we're increasingly seeing overheating, and perhaps more of an issue in newer buildings than older ones. So I wonder if either of you have got any thoughts on how that relates to carbon neutrality.
Yeah, Nick, certainly we've probably made more progress with this in the school sector than we have, to be honest, in the housing sector, because I mentioned during my introduction, some of the things that we want to do are actually slightly easier to do with a school structure than they are with a domestic dwelling. But we've always got a compromise between what we're trying to achieve. So we develop our buildings with a very high level of fabric insulation, and that's not just to keep the warmth in, it's to keep the heat out. So that helps. And recently, and it goes back actually to your thing on the health agenda as well, we've been working with the educationalists to explore the use of planting schemes around the buildings to create a more natural environment. It helps with the overheating, because you can start to shade the building. So we design buildings with very big windows to maximize the amount of natural light, but that generates the compromise that it also creates the opportunity for massive overheating on certain aspects. But if you plant silver birch, for example, almost right up to the structure, you can create a much more pleasant, dappled, light environment, and particularly in school structures that are designed for special needs children. From an educational point of view, that's a much more effective environment. We have more difficulty in persuading the planners to enable us to do that for housing, but there's no reason why we couldn't. It's just that there's that resistance to doing something that's a bit unusual, and doesn't the building become undermined, etc. And so we've got to be able to prove to people that that's worth doing, and that there are also technological options that we've got. So we will often fit air source heat pumps within the building, and they can work in both directions. So primarily they've been fitted to help to contribute to the heating of the house, but during the summer you can reverse the cycle and use it to extract heat from the air. You've then got to have a thermal mass to dump it into. So again, in the housing product, we oversize the water cylinder, which is in the attic space, so that we've got somewhere to dump heat. It's not perfect, but it's certainly a much better carbon solution than fitting air conditioning, for example.
Thank you. I think, Lucy, is there anything, I guess, from your perspective you'd like to touch on?
Thank you. I think, as you suggested, Nick, well-being is, we design buildings for people, and well-being is absolutely critical. And I think the trouble is carbon neutrality doesn't really look at the whole picture. When we talk about sustainable buildings, we can include well-being and health. But if you're just talking about carbon neutrality, there's less area to discuss well-being. We run an annual conference with the Alliance for Sustainable Building Products on healthy buildings, and this year it was obviously very COVID focused, and indoor air quality is absolutely critical to people's health. We're all spending so much more time indoors. We already did spend a lot of time indoors, but we're now spending even more time at home indoors. And therefore, indoor air quality has to be good for us. Anything like mold or any kind of damp is going to affect our indoor air quality. I also think there's an interesting other aspect to COVID, which is if we are going to be working more at home, in order to maintain our well-being, we can't be working on a laptop on our ironing board. So new buildings have to have space for people to work at home from. You know, a studio apartment hopefully will be a thing of the past, because you can't expect somebody to cook, live, wash and work in one room. And I think this will be an interesting change in how we design new buildings. I don't know if Mark's got any comments in terms of planning policy on this, but we have to be able to live and work healthily in our buildings, and buildings can make us sick, and it's very easy to avoid that.
Nick, do you want me to come back on that?
Yeah, Phil.
Yeah, I think that raises a really interesting point, Lucy, about both how we use internal spaces, but also actually thinking about it, how we use external spaces as well. So one of the things that we've observed during periods of hot weather, and in a way it's kind of obvious, but the data is now there to support it, is that the use of parks and green spaces significantly goes up. So in other words, people go outside to find cooler, more pleasant spaces to be. And so I think one of the key considerations is how we're going to make sure that people have access to those, that they're the right type of spaces and that they're in the right locations so that people can kind of actively use them. And then, as you say, it's key to think how we're going to make sure that internally we're able to maintain both comfort in terms of the space requirements and how we're going to use those, but also in terms of internal temperatures and things. And it's a really tricky one to get over, because the changes in average temperatures and peak temperatures feel very marginal. If you look at them on the page, they look to be quite insignificant, but the reality is they make a very big difference to the way we react and how pleasant it feels. And so it's a really kind of marked change. And of course, the rate of churn of buildings is such that the buildings we construct today will be probably realistically only halfway through their life by 2050, come 2080. So we need to get it right now in terms of all of those things.
Thank you. I don't know if it must be some sort of climate change issue. The rain is actually hammering down on my roof here, so I don't know if I'm able to hear me over the background noise. But we've had some questions, kind of sort of grouping them together around, I guess, the difference between design intent and reality, and sort of understanding how our buildings and I guess our spaces between buildings and our wider cities are actually performing. You've all sort of touched on the importance of that. So Mark, your insight around how people use parks, us understanding any kind of performance gap between energy performance in buildings. It feels to me that we're not great with the data as an industry. We don't necessarily really know, we don't even know what we don't know, let alone kind of being able to get a grip on good evidence base around it. How important do you feel that is to us being able to kind of accelerate this stuff, because it all needs to happen at pace and at scale now, and I think a lot of people are going to be looking for evidence. Is there, maybe if I kind of phrase it as a question, putting together some of the questions, is there kind of one key piece of evidence you think is missing that would be really key to kind of unlocking this? Feel free, anyone, to kind of jump in on this one.
I would say air tightness, because I think air tightness is such an misunderstood principle, and the targets are missed often because we have very small gaps in the external envelopes, and because contractors don't understand that 1 millimetre gap makes such a significant difference to heat loss and to moisture control. So I would like to see the building regulations beefed up a lot, and air tightness be a lot the measures to be, or the targets to be a lot more robust, because we'd get better performing buildings quite quickly. Get some training for building control officers who then would understand what this means, so that when they inspect a property they can enforce compliance, and it results in better indoor air quality and lower fuel bills. So if I had to have a magic wand for one thing, that's what I'd try and address.
Yeah, we build very airtight buildings. That's a fundamental part of our design principle, and I would agree with you that it's badly misunderstood, and it is one of the key reasons we build in the factory, because it's much easier to enforce those disciplines in controlling the spaces. I think the energy balance is also important to monitor. There's actually an interesting challenge in the residential sector. So 100% of our schools, we fit energy monitoring, and so we can live monitor the balance between what the renewables are producing and what the energy is being consumed, and without getting buried in the jargon, we fit a data network so that we can, if the school specifies it, we can address individual pieces of equipment within the structure. We can of course do that in houses, but there's a GDPR issue about who can have access to that data, and so you would need the permission of the resident to be able to monitor that information. Clearly, that's a challenge. So we can fit the kit that allows you to monitor it, and we do on homes that are owned and operated by a landlord who's prepared to take on those data confidentiality issues. But so I think energy balance in terms of the ongoing performance, and certainly air tightness as part of the as-built confirmation that you're delivering what you should be doing.
Thank you. Mark and John, is there any kind of, I guess, data or evidence from your side that you think could be potentially key to this?
Well, just to add to what Steve and Lucy have said, I mean, I agree. I think there's two aspects to this. One is around quality assurance, and you know, there does seem to be evidence to show that without that, the difference between what a building's meant to do on paper and what it does in reality can be really quite large. So you can see differences of 200 to 400%. And if you think about it, that's well, it's a huge difference, but it's also a bit like buying your fridge or freezer from your retail store and getting home and finding that the sticker on it was out by 200, 400%, we just wouldn't accept it. So there's a kind of, you know, it is a massive gap there. And it does seem to be that where you've got quality assurance, where you've got building systems that are externally quality assured and verified, that performance gap comes down, and in some cases it's entirely eliminated. And then I think the other aspect of that is around training. You know, if we want people to deliver very high performance buildings with a very low tolerance of defects and to deliver the air tightness that Lucy and Steve have both mentioned, people need to be trained to understand how to do that, and that requires a level of skill to be able to do that. And so I think the whole system has to kind of feed in to delivering that. But it's absolutely critical. We can't base energy strategies on a particular expectation of building performance and then find that they're completely wrong. It just throws everything out, as well as just people are essentially not getting what they're paying for in terms of the performance of their buildings.
I think there's a question of resource, or an issue of resource maybe at a local authority level to provide that regulatory function, you know, not just in terms of building regulations, but all the way down to assessment of a travel plan for a development, for instance, you know, and there is virtually never a follow-up question, you know, to a developer of a travel plan. How is the development performing? Now you've got residents that have moved in, because you can't control who moves into a new development. So no, I think there is a huge issue in terms of you know, resource availability, considering what we've been through over the last decade of austerity and almost the rug being pulled out from underneath local authorities to tackle some of these issues. That yeah, there's a real need to have you know, bums on seats for people to be able to perform these regulatory functions that we now are realizing that we need desperately.
Mark, just thinking about that in terms of, you mentioned a kind of new standard. You talked in your thing around actually moving towards a new standard because of the rate of change and things like that. Just picking up on John's sort of comments around, I guess, assurance and being there and making sure that quality. We've had a kind of question come in that asks a bit more, if you could elaborate a bit more on that standard you're talking about, and asking whether it's, you know, is it like an ISO standard? Does it have a sort of processes and procedures that link to its implementation and understanding whether it's working or not?
Yeah, so what I was alluding to was a process called the local plan review. So the planning policies that apply at the moment to new development were adopted in 2011, and they were developed in the 2-3 years before that. And so we've been going through this process of local plan review, which essentially is to review those policies and revise them, taking into account of local commitments, national commitments, etc. And as I say, under that process, where the emerging policies went out to consultation in May 2019, the expectation at that point was that those new policies would have come into effect about now, would have gone through an examination in public, and then if they'd gone through that without change, would have come into effect now. But they were also linked to this joint spatial plan, which applies across the 4 unitary authorities. And because of the delays to that, that process implementing those new policies in Bristol, as well as in the other 3 UAs, has been delayed. So we're now back into a sort of, we're starting again, not quite again, but we're having to go back to quite an early stage in that local plan review process. And clearly some of the things that we were expecting to bring forward may well change, because quite a lot's changed over the last year to 18 months and will continue to change going forward. But that's the stage we're at the moment. We're going back through that local plan review process to look at those new planning policies.
Okay, thank you. We've had a number of questions. I'll make sure I don't want to miss this area, but we touched on it, I think primarily you, Lucy, in terms of the Futureproof stuff, and touching on skills, training, that side of it. There's several questions linked to it, particularly around sort of how to make it sort of bigger and better, I guess, in terms of expanding what you've done already successfully, but reaching maybe more of the industry, I guess, perhaps your different regions, different scales, contractors, subcontractors, suppliers. I mean, I spent a number of times working for a major contractor, and I think that supply chain, their supply chain, is so key. Have you touched on a few areas, but are there particular groups you are keen to reach and have sort of ideas around how that could happen?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. So the funding, we can only limit it to West of England at the moment, but because of COVID and because of transferring to online, we can offer the training nationwide now. So any contractor around any part of the UK, well, or anywhere, in fact. I think we had an inquiry from somewhere in France recently. There is no reason why this can't be accessed from anywhere. We just can't pay at the moment because we don't have the funding for it. We are trying to change that model so it's self-sustaining, so we can offer at least subsidised training going forward from March. But we've identified, because it's retrofit, the people we've identified to train are the contractors that are actually going to do it. So we're not really going for the larger companies, we're going for the small, not necessarily sole traders, but people who work with small bands of people. These are the people who are going to be delivering the retrofit, and this is often where some of the biggest problems come. So that's our target audience. But we also recognise that SME contractors work with other people. So I mentioned we've already been training building control officers. I did a session for South Gloucestershire last week. But pre-COVID, we were working with Kellaway building suppliers, because, as you've rightly said, the supply chain is key to this. Many of our builders say they'd love to be able to use a particular material, they can't get hold of it. And we were on the cusp of Kellaway having a sort of green corner to their stores. And then we got this little visitor called COVID, and it all went sort of pear-shaped. But we realised that builders don't work in a vacuum. So we're trying to sort of work with all the people that builders work with as well, so that when a builder does try and do the right thing, they don't come up against a barrier.
I think it's really key, that sort of whole systems approach, because say it's a very fragmented industry. There's a lot of different interfaces, whether that's physical interfaces between materials or interfaces between professions and trades. And I think practically that's where a lot can get lost in translation. Is where you can end up with literally gaps in your building, as well as sort of gaps in responsibility. And I guess Steve, I guess thinking about you and the skills that come from skills and awareness, I guess, that come from a kind of factory built environment, that's obviously there's a whole load of learning there. Do you kind of share any of that learning with the wider industry, or are you interested in sharing that?
Yeah, so we have our own apprenticeship scheme. So we've currently got 5 apprentices, and we are working with a local college to expand that so that they can use our environment to train a larger number of apprentices, but using and understanding our system and way of working. That's due to launch in the early days of next year. So I would echo that training is absolutely critical, and we have to change fundamentally the way in which we are describing our building designs in order to make them the information accessible to the people who are actually going to do the work. So in my in-house design team, I've got twice as many people doing the detailed design as I've got architects doing the headline design, if you like. And the example that I use to explain that difference is that, if you take another industry, let's say the aircraft industry, there are over 40,000 rivets on each wing of a 747. I know that's out of service now, but that shows how old I am. That's the example I used. The people in the factory putting those rivets in have absolutely no influence on where they go. The position of every single rivet is determined in the design process. And the job of the people in the factory is to make sure those rivets get put in properly. If you contrast that with dry lining, putting the plasterboard into the structure of a house, how that's fixed to the wall is left entirely to the skill of the individual plasterer. You hope that they know the rules. You hope that they know it's at 300 centres or is it 200 centres, and does that change when you go around an aperture? And anyway, where does the first screw go? Do you work from the floor up or the ceiling down? And the reason you need tradespeople to do that is that traditionally we've relied on them making those decisions. So if you've got a well-trained and thorough tradesperson, you get a fantastic building. If you've got someone who's a little bit less knowledgeable or a bit slapdash, then you get something that's very variable. We work to get our design team to specify all of that, and then we train that out into the workforce. So those key decisions are made once and then repeated lots of times. So training absolutely critical. And I think we reach out to schools. I mean, it's lucky that we build schools. One of the things that I always do when we're building a school is to invite the school to come and see what our building environment looks like. And I have a personal mission to make construction an attractive career choice for people from all walks of life. It's been too often seen as the dumping ground for the difficult kids, and it shouldn't be that. It should be an environment which can provide stimulating and wide-ranging careers for people with all sorts of backgrounds and abilities. We don't just need people. In fact, we don't need people that lay bricks because we don't use bricks. But we need computer specialists to design and implement building management systems. We need people that understand the stuff that Lucy and others have been talking about in terms of calculating daylighting and energy usage within the building. So there's lots and lots of different things that we need to work to make it a lively, modern, exciting industry to be involved with. And I think that's the best way that we can get the right people thinking and delivering the things that are needed to achieve these goals.
Great, thank you. I'm just aware of time, as I hoped and sort of felt. We've got way more questions than we have got time, so we're due to wrap up in about a minute. So I think we'll have to draw it to a close there. So I'd just like to thank the panel very much on behalf of the audience here for your insights, ideas, and time this morning. I think we've covered a wide range of areas. I think highlighted the kind of scale and complexity of all this, the interrelatedness of it all, and I think looking at it through maybe what 2020 has kind of, how it sort of disrupted it in terms of our patterns and our maybe spending more time in our homes. I think I'm trying to finish this year on a positive around actually what can we take from this experience that's, you know, not about reverting back to the great old days of 2019 where we weren't doing that much towards our climate emergency anyway. So what can we keep from this change that's positive? I'd just like to thank the sponsor again, so NetZero Buildings. Thank you very much for making this event happen. I'd also like to thank all the participants for listening and for raising really good questions. Sorry if I didn't get to your question or question area this morning. I'd just like to remind those watching that there are still a couple, at least I think 3 more events as part of the Bristol Housing Festival. You can see them on Bristol Housing Festival's website. All the events are free, spaces are limited. So I think with that, thank you very much and have a great day. Thank you.